On behalf of the University of York and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, welcome to this special event to pay tribute to Professor Mark Ormrod. Mark passed away on August the 2nd this year after a lengthy period of illness in which he continued to be active as an academic and member of the university community. Mark's kind and considerate approach to life touched us all, and today is an opportunity to share memories, recollections, stories, and tributes. Mark had an exceptional ability to cross boundaries. He was both an excellent academic and a highly skilled manager who always held in high regard the people as well as the roles he was dealing with. Appointed to the university in 1990, he was subsequently twice director of the Center for Medieval Studies and twice head of Department of History. Mark was our first Dean of Faculty at York, initially a role which developed from one of our subject coordinators for the Arts of Humanities. Mark upheld the importance of collaboration in his approach to the deanship, setting a very high standard for future deans to follow. We will hear recollections later tonight about Mark's projects, academic work, and the many ways in which he touched our lives. He will be greatly missed by our whole community across the university and by historians and medievalists around the world. We've been comforted by messages of condolence sent in from this global community, and our deepest sympathy is with his family and partner. I am certain Mark's memory will live on at York through colleagues, former students, and friends. We will honour it institutionally through the establishment of the Mark Ormrod Fund to support master's scholarships, the Mark Ormrod PhD Prize, and to support the Centre for Medieval Studies. Please do encourage colleagues and friends to support this. Paul Ramsbottom, CEO of the Wolfson Foundation, captures much of what I wanted to say today. He writes, Mark had a rare combination of tremendous intellect and great kindness. It was clear that this translated itself into wonderful support for postgraduate students and early career researchers. It is a sad loss for both York and the academic community generally. I had the privilege myself of being a head of department working under Mark's direction when faculties were established. Mark offered clear leadership, yet was very willing to act as a sounding board for ideas and plans, however ill-formed they might have been. He had a keen eye for innovation and understood what makes the arts and humanities so special. This, for me, was some of the best management I've experienced at a higher education institution. You knew where you stood on difficult issues and were able to talk through opportunities and problems nonetheless. He would always have something constructive to add to the most challenging of situations. I think of that often as I work daily in what I still think of as Mark's office in Haslington Hall. So let's begin. I'm very grateful to my colleagues and to Mark's family for bringing us together tonight to celebrate Mark's remarkable life and considerable achievements. Craig, over to you.
Many thanks, Ambrose. I can't see myself. There we go. Okay. Hi. Well, we meet today under very unusual circumstances. An event like this should be taking place in York Minster. And indeed, we very much hope that will be the case next year. We aim to have a service in the autumn taking place in the Minster and combining that service of commemoration with an academic event to celebrate Mark's scholarship. That will certainly give many more people the opportunity to share their memories of Mark. But in the meantime, we're very grateful to everyone who's written to us and shared their stories. We would be delighted to receive any further reminiscences, either during this event using the question and answer function on the screen, or afterwards by email sent to the office at the Centre for Medieval Studies. A large team of people have come together to organise this event today, so I would like to express our thanks and gratitude to those individuals who have been and are working in the background to make all of this possible right now. That is to say, Joan Buchanan, Sharon Oakley, Sarah Mitchell, Naomi Richards, Catherine Leach, Craig Lomas, as well as Elizabeth Tyler, Gillian Galloway, Brittany Scowcroft, and Laura Stewart. Of course, there is one other person who helped plan today. It should surprise no one that I'm actually referring to Mark himself. With typical thoughtfulness, Mark took the time and trouble to jot down detailed suggestions for organising an event like this. Following that advice, we are dividing this event into 3 parts, focusing upon Mark's accomplishments as a teacher, as a scholar, and as a colleague. And to kick things off, I would like to introduce one of Mark's students, Joanna Chamberlain, who completed a degree in English and history here at York before then studying for an MA and a PhD in our Centre for Medieval Studies. She is now a visiting research fellow at the University of Reading and has published 2 celebrated monographs entitled The Last Medieval Queens and Cecily, Duchess of York, both of which originated in research that Mark supervised. Joanna, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you, Craig. Mark Ormrod was, by any measure, an exceptional teacher. I first met him when I was an undergrad. I arrived in York in 1990, just as he started teaching there. I was studying English and history, and I actually thought back then that English was my stronger subject, and it was largely due to Mark's classes that I somehow evolved into a historian instead. My first experience of his teaching was a first-year spring term lecture course on states and state building in later medieval Europe. Like other students who've left their reminiscences on social media, I swiftly decided he was a favourite lecturer. And I admit his accent had something to do with that. But more than that, the lectures were so beautifully, clearly structured and carefully paced. And I was really struggling to master the art of note-taking, but Mark's lectures made me feel confident about what I was doing. A couple of weeks ago, I actually dug out the notes that I wrote back then, and I found that they were pretty much twice as long as my other notes for lectures for that term. And his style didn't just mean that I had a genuinely useful and coherent record. They were also sort of lectures with training wheels, because they made the whole process easier going forwards. And so while it was style that struck me, Gwilym Dodd, who also started in 1990, remembers more how he was impressed by the substance. To quote Gwyl, "I remember at the time being in awe of Mark's ability to find structure and coherence in mind-bogglingly complex historical phenomena, and to convey his own analysis and synthesis of these phenomena in such a straightforward and accessible way." Gwyl is not the only one of Mark's students who still uses those lecture notes in their work today. My husband's principal memory of those lectures was a consequence of his habit of diving out of the hall at the end of the lecture before in order to grab a coffee from his machine in the next building, and then heading back in for Mark's lecture. So on one occasion he was leaving as Mark arrived through the same door, and Mark said, "I'll wait for you to get back then." That was Mark's sense of humour, but it was also indicative of how he noticed everyone as individuals, one among so many who should have been in his lecture. And the time that Mark took to notice and be interested in anyone, no matter their status, is something so many people have remarked on. I felt this in my seminar classes with Mark in the summer of my first year. I somehow got the impression before this that combined subject students were seen as a bit flaky and uncommitted. So it was a revelation for me to find that Mark saw my interest in literature as a strength, and he encouraged me to weave that into my study of history. This cultural approach to political history is, I later realised, typical of Mark's scholarship, and it's probably the reason I decided that history was so much more interesting than literature. For Gwyl, it was Mark's Year 2 module on state and society in 15th century England that really fired his interest. To quote Gwyl again, "I remember the skill with which he developed discussion with questions pitched at just the right level. He was challenging and supportive at the right time. The overriding thing is that he made medieval history seem easy. I look back now and see this as another measure of Mark's incredible intellect. He knew how to pitch things at just the right level. So that's why Gwyll and I were both signed up to Mark's special subject in our final year, England at War, 1290 to 1360. And on day one, he handed us files of photocopies, 199 hand-numbered pages of selected extracts from primary sources. I do still have them. It was an exhausting and exhilarating term, deep in research-led teaching and inspirational. It was also a fabulous springboard to go on to research degrees. Mark's responsibilities to undergraduates extended beyond lectures, seminars, and tutorials to being a pastoral supervisor as well. Paul Hodges wrote to the Centre for Medieval Studies to share just how much Mark's support and compassion in that role was valued too. To quote, "Without his support, I could not have gained my first or had the confidence to do my doctorate." My own postgraduate years were all at York's Centre for Medieval Studies, and I feel that centre had rather more than its fair share of academics who, like Mark, combined impressive intellect with exceptional generosity. They made it such a lovely, supportive, fun community to be a part of, and I think most of us students had no idea quite how fortunate we were until much later. And this was in the early years, before Richard Dobson, Mark's partner and husband, became a part of the CMS community. A major feature of later students' recollections was their warm memories of meals at Mark and Richard's house. For the MA, Mark was teaching on the Richard II option, and Joel Burden sent me his recollections of Mark's classes for this. I quote, "He took teaching seriously and appeared to enjoy it, unlike so many academics who seemed to consider it a bit of an annoyance that got in the way of their precious research. His classes empowered you to take part. Complicated things always seemed comprehensible in Mark's hands." My MA dissertation was on a noblewoman, so Mark was on my supervisory team, along with Felicity Riddy, and the two of them also supervised my DPhil. And my principal memory of those supervision meetings is how wonderful it was to be part of a conversation with two such brilliant minds discussing something that I found fascinating. Christian Liddy, who was working on his DPhil at the same time, says, "I loved being in the archives and sharing my half-understood findings with Mark. I would see that his light was on in the office on the ground floor of the CMS at King's Manor and knock on his door. I knew that he would always find time for me. He would pull out his own notes on documents that he'd read at the National Archives and share them with me. His intellectual generosity was extraordinary." At the same time as supervising Christian, Joel, and I at the CMS, Mark was also sole supervisor for Gwyll and Jonathan Mackman and Monica Simon in the history department. And Gwyll was pretty much Mark's first DPhil student, but only realised this 10 years ago. He says he was shocked because Mark seemed so competent, knowledgeable, and reassuring. It seemed he'd been supervising PhD students forever. Lisa Benz, 10 years later, particularly remembers Mark working through a chapter with her that really wasn't working out, and how he gently guided her into understanding this. It was only when she got home after the meeting that she realised what he meant when he'd casually suggested it might be time to open a new Word document. She needed to start from scratch. She says, "To this day, any time I find myself starting over in life, I've just said, 'You've done this before. It's just time to open up a new Word document.'" Monica says she mostly remembers Mark's patience and a steady supply of tissues when the stress of the upgrade process reduced her to tears. But of course, Mark could be firm when needed. Gwyll recalls an undergraduate class in which Mark accused them all of being sleepy. Guiding us through the nitty-gritty of crafting our half-baked ideas into a thesis to be proud of was only a part of Mark's teaching. He looked after us in so many ways. Joel had actually thought a DPhil was going to be impossible after his MA because he didn't get British Academy funding, and he'd already left York when he got a phone call from Mark. Entirely off his own bat, Mark had been working on another option. He'd persuaded the history department to give Joel a teaching contract, which meant Joel's tuition fees could be waived. This meant Joel could do the DPhil, and it strengthened his position to get British Academy funding later on. And there's a lovely illustration of the ripples of impact here, because one of Joel's students that year was Helen Lacey, and at the celebration for Mark's 60th, she told Joel that his was the course that fired her enthusiasm for medieval history. starting her own journey to become Mark's supervisee a few years later. You perhaps saw her words about Mark on Twitter. He shaped my career and my life with his generosity and kindness. So many people have memories of Mark's startling, unexpected generosity. When Lisa Benz made her first trip to the National Archives, Mark arranged for Lisa Howarth to meet her at the B&B and show her around. And again, on Lisa's first trip to Kalamazoo, he'd asked Doug Biggs and Jeff Hamilton to look out for her at the White Hart sessions. Even his inaugural lecture as professor was an event to boost his students' confidence. He wove in references to the research being done by so many of us at the centre. I remember feeling thrilled and so proud to be part of this scholarly community. Students who were not Mark's supervisees still experienced his academic generosity, be that in conversations about 14th century topics, or learning to teach by working alongside him as they were completing their DPhils. Andy Hopper taught the Armies and Societies comparative course with him, and he says, Mark's generous encouragement and guidance built my confidence, as I'm sure it did for so many others. Andy went on to say, then he kindly employed me on the Yorkshire Lord Lieutenants and High Sheriffs project, which kept me in funds at that difficult moment between completing the PhD and securing my first academic post. Mark's particular support for early career researchers dealing with precarity is something I think many have especially appreciated. We were always made very aware that the thesis was not an end in itself, and the research needs to be published. Catherine Lewis was speaking on kingship and masculinity at Kalamazoo when Mark asked her, Catherine, when are we going to see these exciting ideas of yours in print? That feels such a Mark way to express it. Catherine says this was what gave her the courage to move into political history, and that she would never have published the book without Mark's encouragement. As those of us in the 1990s cohort were almost finished, Mark arranged for several of us to meet up with a publisher, Tony Morris, in Cafe Concerto on High Petergate. But Mark took me on one side before I went to say to me, don't let him persuade you to cut your thesis down and package it for a popular audience. It should be published as it is. And he was so right in recognizing that I still hadn't enough confidence in my own work, and I needed that warning. Without that, my thesis would not have made it to Oxford University Press. The sense of being one of Mark's students has lasted decades, because he has never stopped supporting, making connections, invitations to present papers, or making opportunities for publication. Lisa Benz wrote, even now, students and young academics who never knew Mark ask me what it was like to work with him, and I can always hear a tone of awe and envy in their questions. We all know we were so privileged. I'm going to finish with some of Christian's words because I can't improve on them. When I think of Mark, as I often do, I remember his energy and industry, but I also remember his kindness and empathy. He was a rare academic, a brilliant scholar, yet also a lovely, lovely man. Not only a model academic, but ultimately a father figure. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share these memories of Mark as a teacher, and I'd like to hand over now to Dr. D. Dias of the University of York and Professor Gibbon Wilson of the University of St Andrews. They'll be turning their attentions to Mark's remarkable accomplishments as a researcher.
Thank you very much. I'm a medievalist by training and have for many years been director of the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture, which is part of the history department at York and which Mark helped to establish. The last time I saw Mark, shortly before he died, he asked if I would be willing to take part in his funeral. I replied that although it would not exactly be a joy, it would be a huge privilege. And I got that characteristic little Mark smile. To be asked to contribute today is also a great honour, but also a joy, as so many of us bring together our memories of a truly remarkable man. Most of us probably knew Mark in a number of roles: outstanding scholar, teacher, mentor, friend, director of the Centre for Medieval Studies, head of department, superb university administrator, and representative and advocate of the arts and humanities. Together, we're looking at an extraordinarily rich life from many angles, and our memories are bound to overlap and converge. But what all of us will have found is at the heart of all of those roles was a very special person. And what was so striking and so rare about Mark was his consistent integrity and generosity of spirit, whatever the context in which you encountered him. At this point in the evening, we are focusing on Mark's scholarship and his enormous contribution in this area. And first, we're going to hear from Professor Chris Gibbon Wilson from the University of St Andrews, who's going to speak about Mark's research.
Thank you, Dee, and thank you, Craig, and everyone else who has organized this event. And good evening, everybody. One of the many sad things about Mark's death at the age of 62 is that it robbed him of the chance to bring his life's work as a scholar to completion. In other words, to write the big book on the English state in the 14th century, which he was planning to write in his retirement. Because this is what Mark's research was focused on, and he was a very focused historian. He worked almost exclusively on English history, and he rarely strayed much beyond the 14th century, although his unstoppable momentum did occasionally, I suspect almost accidentally, take him into the early 15th. His specialism was, of course, the governmental, administrative, and political history of late medieval England, nuts, bolts, and all. And the reason why he remained so focused was because he really wanted to understand how these things worked. And he knew that there was always more to learn. As far as Mark was concerned, history was not compartmentalized. Each new document he unearthed, each new topic he explored, was in his mind one more piece of the jigsaw which he spent his working life assembling, the whole picture which he would have loved to end by depicting. But I don't want to spend too much time lamenting what might have been, but rather to celebrate what there is. For someone like myself, who only saw Mark once or twice a year, usually at conferences, it was quite difficult to keep track of what he was working on. Each time it seemed to be something different. And what that often meant was that what he had been working on the previous year had been finished and quite possibly already published. I also remember that I often felt a slight trepidation when I asked him what he was working on. How close was it to something I had also worked on in the past? If so, what had Mark discovered that I hadn't? What new insights had he had that I hadn't? Because Mark loved burrowing in archives, which meant that he was always finding new things. He believed in getting his hands dirty, which continually led him to new angles of investigation. Mark's output was astonishing, perhaps even intimidating. Over a publishing career spanning 35 years, he wrote 9 books and edited several more, plus about 80 articles or book chapters. In addition, he either directed or was involved in a succession of big research projects, which produced major data sets of source collections. In one sense, these projects showed Mark at his best, because research for him was not competitive. Research for him was a collaborative undertaking. I'm sure that, like many academics, he loved those peaceful moments when he was free to get on with writing or browsing in libraries or archives, but he was also unfailingly generous about sharing ideas and discoveries. He was also a great conference goer, always well prepared, always with something new to say. And of course, he knew that big projects were a way of providing early career impetus for his postgraduates and postdoctoral students. This was a duty of care which he took very seriously. And I'm sure that many of you here, or rather there tonight, will have benefited from it. If you were to trace the trajectory of Mark's career as a historian, it would look something like this. His doctoral thesis and the early work resulting from it marked him out initially as a historian of the English state, particularly state finance. This involved a lot of graphs and tables, which he was extremely good at, but also increasingly it focused on people. For example, on the burdens of the taxpayer, as well as the mechanisms of the tax gatherer. State finance was a theme to which he often returned and never really left. For instance, his article about Archbishop Scrope's Rising, which he published in 2005, the 600th anniversary of Scrope's death, was constructed on a meticulous foundation of the demands for taxes imposed on the clergy of the Northern Diocese in the early years of Henry IV's reign, and the gradual buildup of pressure which these demands produced. It's a classic example of the forensic way in which he approached research, enabling him thereby to answer big questions in original ways. Generally speaking, however, by the mid-1990s, Mark was moving on. A succession of books and articles published in the decade or so between 1995 and 2005 showed how his interests had broadened to include Parliament, law, and justice. These included jointly authored books on the Black Death and on the evolution of English justice. But the book I particularly want to mention is his Political Life in Medieval England, 1300 to 1450. Because although it was quite short, it was probably one of his most influential books, partly because it coincided with a group of publications by Gerald Harris, John Watts, Christine Carpenter, which between them set a new agenda for the study of political society in late medieval England, an agenda which placed the emphasis on inclusivity, cooperative government, and the integration and expansion of the polity. Mark's interest in seeing what he called the worm's eye view never slackened. He wanted to write bottom-up as well as top-down history, history from the inside as well as from the outside. No sooner were the Parliament rolls finished than he was off again, co-directing another major research project to catalogue 18,000 ancient petitions in the National Archives. This not only produced a marvelously well-organized and informative website, but also a number of fascinating spin-offs, one of which enabled him finally to clarify the origins and family of Edward III's mistress, Alice Perrers. Mark's interest in Alice Perrers also chimed with another growing interest of his, gender history and especially women's history. This too, I think, was to him a part of his desire to arrive at a new understanding of political society in late medieval England, a political society which he felt ought to encapsulate the often neglected role of powerful women. But it also led to a growing interest in the history of gender. And as ever, he immersed himself in the existing literature and found ways of coming up with new approaches to much debated questions. For example, his 2006 article on the sexualities of Edward II. The last decade of Mark's life saw him take on another enormous and very timely collaborative task, the chronicling of England's immigrants, 1350 to 1550. Yet another magnificent database was produced, 65,000 names, and amazingly easy to use. And all the time he kept producing new books, new articles, but always seemed to be available to help cheerfully and enthusiastically with the many queries which people, including myself, sent him. So as a historian, Mark was something of a force of nature. He was also a scholar and a gentleman. Even if he disagreed with fellow historians, he did so respectfully. The impact he had on our understanding of the late medieval English political society was enormous. His superb Yale biography of Edward III, published in 2011, might well turn out to be his best remembered work. But there is much more for which he deserves to be remembered too. So many facets to his work that there hasn't been time for me to mention. And amazingly, there is more to come. His last book was sent to the publisher just 10 days before his death. We and our successors will be citing him, quoting him, and remembering him with both admiration and fondness for many years to come. Thank you. And now I'll hand you back to Dee.
Thank you very much, Chris. Chris has spoken of Mark's great contribution as a scholar, but his achievements in this area and as a leader, as Chris has hinted, go far beyond what Mark did himself. They also lie in what he enabled others to do, by example, encouragement, stimulus, and support. And this is where his character and his academic gifts united to create something very special, an infinitely positive, gracious, and supportive colleague, concerned not only for his own development, but for that of others. And that attitude has had an enormously beneficial impact, not only within the University of York, but across the world of medieval studies and beyond. For me, he was both, for the almost 20 years I've been on the staff at York, both mentor and friend, without whom I would never have achieved a fraction of the things he helped make possible through his encouragement, wise advice, ever generous sharing of his knowledge and experience, and that smile and sense of fun which so often help lighten the load. Mark worked very closely with me on the first large Arts and Humanities Research Council grant application I submitted. I still felt much too junior to be doing this at this point, but Mark believed I should, and if Mark thought you should be doing something, you did it. It was a very ambitious arts and humanities and social science collaboration, and challenging both to organise and write. We went through endless drafts trying to achieve real synergy between the methodologies and terminology of two very different disciplines. And it's characteristic that Mark showed infinite commitment to making this work, not because he would gain glory out of it, that was never his focus, but because he thought it an important project and he wanted to help me learn how to plan and run it. Eventually, he read the final draft and said, "Now it makes me feel all warm and fuzzy as a historian. You can submit it." The proposal clearly made the AHRC panel feel all warm and fuzzy as well. And Mark went on, with great generosity, to chair the project board and provide support as I learnt how to steer the great enterprise we'd created. It then produced two follow-on projects, again, which Mark supported so generously. What working with Mark gave all of us was not only contact with a great and stimulating intellect, characterized by great clarity and incisiveness, but also with a humanity that valued people, treated them with great respect, and wanted them to flourish. The climate of research collaboration he created was one which was therefore immensely productive. A strong character, very clear thinker, he was nevertheless a very patient teacher. And when you were veering off track or not quite getting things right, you'd get that little smile and be gently steered in the right direction. So many of us owe so much to that kindness and generosity of spirit. There have been many fine scholars, but only one Mark Ormrod, and he was and is much loved. Now I'm going to hand over to Professor Sarah Rhys-Jones.
Thank you, Joanna, Chris, and Dee, for painting us such a rich portrait of Mark the man, teacher, and colleague. In this section, I'm going to share with Professor Judith Buchanan, who will follow after me, to talk about Mark not only as a colleague, but also as a member of the university management team. Before I do that, though, I want to say a couple of personal things. Mark first came to York in 1990 to replace me on the second occasion that I took maternity leave. But of course, as you've guessed, he soon rapidly overtook me and was promoted to full professor in 1995. Since then, our careers have boxed and coxed, sometimes working together, but not always. However, the closest period that I particularly enjoyed was really over the last 6 years, when first of all he roped me in. Mark was a good roper in of people to help him with his work on England's immigrants, and particularly with the public engagement aspects of that work relating to the national school curriculum. And then secondly, he helped me launch a new project on the registers of the Archbishops of York, known as the Northern Way. It's been a real delight, even as Mark has had to retire through ill health, to share and see his dedication to research, to students. He would still come in teaching until early this year because he wanted to. And above all, and I really wanted to add this to what's been said so far, his work in popularising access to the Middle Ages. He was truly inspired by his work on the national curriculum, on the history, the deep history, the long history of immigration into the British Isles. And I know that had he been spared, that was one of his greatest ambitions, was to do more work in that area, bringing more of the teaching of medieval history into the school curriculum. He did this working closely with the Historical Association and the education of the National Archives. And although he can't continue that work, I know that legacy will survive and will flourish because of the foundations that he laid. However, to return to my brief, I have been asked to talk to you about the period when Mark was director of the Centre for Medieval Studies and head of the Department of History between 1998 and 2000. During that decade, he held each of those offices twice and was in office continuously, which in itself was a pretty remarkable feat. It was remarkable, not least because that was a very hard decade, I think, in which to be in university middle management, we might call it, between staff centrally and nationally on the one hand, and grassroots academics and lecturers on the other. It was a decade of huge change in which internally universities adopted new business models, in which departments became cost centres, for example, and externally, of course, in which there were new and increasingly demanding national audits of both teaching and research, culminating in the REF that we all enjoy today. The results of all these changes were really dramatic shifts in the way in which we operated on a day-to-day basis, and that brought numerous challenges and tensions which heads of department had to manage. And it was stunning, to say the least, the way in which Mark was able to see and respond to and absorb all this tension associated with these changes, but never disseminate any of it. The kindness, the generosity that we've heard that he extended to his students, he similarly extended to his colleagues, absorbing their stress, giving them sound advice about the best way forward in whatever predicament it was that they had. So through this decade, he steered both the Centre for Medieval Studies and the Department of History through this storm of change and the changes needed to required to adapt to this new research culture, a new phrase in itself. And you've seen already how he did this, how he led from the front. The change led to that remarkable track record in the winning of external grant funding that became a bedrock of his career, building up a graduate research school, not just in his departments, but across the faculty, as he supported the launch of the HRC as one of the constituent heads of department. But doing all this, of course, with the hallmark kindness and generosity that others have mentioned, always able to explain why the tasks that he was asking you to complete were good, not just for the department and the institution, but also for you. So Mark then was a very popular head of department, and given his commitment to interdisciplinarity, to building up and nurturing a graduate school in the arts and humanities that was so evident in his commitment to his departments and the new HRC, nobody was surprised when he was chosen as the first dean, then known as the academic coordinator of the new faculty of the arts and humanities in 2009. And so at this point, I'm going to hand over to Professor Judith Buchanan, who is a professor of literature and who took over from York as Dean of the faculty in 2017, has now moved to Oxford in 2019, and she's now speaking from Oxford as the Master of St. Peter's College. Judith, over to you.
So thank you, Sarah, and a warm hello from a blustery Oxford to all in York and elsewhere in the world. I'm so pleased to be joining you in this shared moment to remember our wonderful colleague and friend. What has already become abundantly clear is that Mark brought special things to our worlds individually and collectively. What is special about the special people in our lives is really hard to capture in words, and tributes, even this lovely run of collated tributes today, can only do so much in evoking and celebrating what Mark was, what he did, and the distinctive and impressive ways in which he found an exquisitely discriminating route through the run of roles he took on over the years. To help me with this, I've turned to 4 people who were colleagues of Mark's in different ways to help me try and build a picture. And those 4 are Dr. David Johnson, who's one of the receptionists in Heslington Hall and himself an amateur historian, Professor Jocelyn Wogan-Brown, previous colleague from York's fine Centre for Medieval Studies, Professor Debbie Smith, former Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research at York, and Dr. Kate Giles, previous Acting Director of the Humanities Research Centre, and also a member of the Centre for Medieval Studies. And I'm going to draw gratefully upon their words shortly. I first met Mark in the year 2000 when, as a newly appointed lecturer in the fabulous English department at York, I attended a cross-departmental best practice session led by Mark about supervising PhD students. And there are lots of details from that best practice session 20 years ago that I still remember, and I have drawn down on it gratefully many times in the years since. Mark proposed ways of managing doctoral projects and the supervisory relationship in ways that found that valuable but necessary duality between being, on the one hand, highly organized, systematic, reassuringly reliable about admin, schedules, turnaround times, etc., and on the other being supportively caught by the intellectual passion of the project on the other, encouraging our doctoral researchers as people as they navigate the odd and wonderful, but often challenging world of academia. And we've already heard how enormously appreciated his own supervision has been by his own doctoral supervisees, and so many of them. So that duality between the uber professional on the one hand and the fully human on the other, that doubleness was something that exemplified many, if not, I think, all of my later engagements with Mark also. I subsequently had the office next to his when he was academic coordinator of the proto-faculty of the Arts and Humanities, and I was director of the Humanities Research Centre. I drank tea, good tea, of course, in Mark's office many times from his lovely office crockery. Mark was always so highly civilized, even in emphatically worky settings. And in this and in so many other ways, he was, for me, as for many others, I know, a model for emulation. I worked with and to Mark on many projects, including as part of the White Rose Consortium team, bidding for AHRC block grant partnership funding for the 3 universities of York, Sheffield, and Leeds. It should be said of the White Rose bidding group that Mark chaired that such were our levels of vision, cooperation, and well-managed execution under Mark's blistering chairmanship that we came out top, bar none, of the national competition for AHRC funding. And as a result, we landed a cool £19.4 million to found the White Rose College of the Arts and Humanities, a doctoral training centre that has been the fertile stable of so many fine doctoral projects and so many fine emerging scholars since. When Mark was then invited to move his office from the Berwick-Saul building to Heslington Hall, Helen Jacobs, Sarah Burton, Philip Morris and I briefly considered chaining ourselves to the railings, or maybe chaining Mark to his Berwick-Saul office or some such, in order to keep him close, as we then saw it, to the academic community and indeed to us, since he was such a brilliant source of institutional savvy and gently but clearly dispensed wisdom. When he then became the first dean of the newly formed faculty, I became associate dean and worked closely with him and with Kate Giles on many projects there too. And then when in due course he stepped back from the deanship to take early retirement in the light of his terminal diagnosis, I initially held the reins as interim dean and was in due course then appointed as dean, to replace him, and so inherited many working patterns, institutional relationships, and projects directly from him. These were big shoes to fill, and it was, of course it was, Mark who told me I would be fine. And I know that I am far from the only person whose work has been directly affected by a supportive interventionist word from Mark. Kate Giles from Archaeology says this: so many of us have benefited from Mark's generosity of spirit, his ability to see what particular challenges might present themselves, to gently encourage and guide us, and to create spaces and opportunities for others to develop and grow. Thank you, Kate. In my first encounter with Mark back in 2000, I don't remember spotting the twinkly eyes that I would later come to know as part of the Mark persona, often communicating so much more than his carefully chosen words did. Nor do I remember the jazzy socks. I'm not even sure jazzy socks were in Mark's sartorial repertoire back then. Others would know better than I on that one, but they certainly became part of it, and an occasional glimpse of vivid colour or eye-catching stripes at the Ormrod ankle enlivened many an otherwise serious moment when the weight of problematic budgets for medium-term planning sessions or HR issues were pressing on us. And trivial as this may seem, those socks were one of the discreet but legible indicators that there was more that was twinkly, impish, and fun about this distinguished medieval historian and discreetly presented faculty dean than the quietly courteous and highly disciplined professional persona might immediately reveal. Certainly, his professionalism was never in doubt. He modelled not saying things in ways that indicated very high levels of personal discipline, even in the face of eyebrow-raising provocation. The nearest he got to indiscreet in a work context would be a response of, well, quite, to a slightly loose word from someone else. And as I remember the potency of his quite, Jocelyn Wogan-Brown, thank you Jocelyn, has reminded me of the understated efficacy of his really when faced with unsound propositions or weak arguments, a single query that was so often effective at securing rethinks. As Mark would fill untold numbers of notebooks with lists as dean, and he worked through those lists diligently and judiciously and with an unwavering sense of priority, following up on work delegated to others, as well as delivering brilliantly, of course, on that which fell to him. His task lists were always, therefore, full of things, so many things, accomplished and accomplished well. It is no surprise that the significant task to deliver the book manuscript should have been one of the last things he did. So many things that weren't done, of course, and so much joy in his retirement with Richard and with the family, both sides of the family, of whom he was so proud. But also so many things that were done. Looking at Mark's lists of achievements, publications, scholarly and public engagement projects, management, mentoring, leadership initiatives, and so on, leaves one slightly breathless. For a man who always seemed so calm, boy, did he get things done. His decanal office, an eyrie in the attic of Heslington Hall, was, as one might imagine, full of books. The books also spilled out of the office onto the bookcases in the little waiting area adjacent, and also along long shelves that occupied most of the run of the Hes Hall attic. In that professional space in which necessarily budget sheets and planning documents and HR protocols and draft strategies and untold sets of minutes from untold numbers of meetings dominated the landscape, it was wonderful being surrounded by a library. And of course, it was an impressive library of medieval history. It was a tangible reminder of the place of scholarship and the practice of scholarship that the strategies and the meetings are centrally there to support. Mark continued his own scholarship, even in the midst of a diary that was fit to bursting with matters of management. And it was, as we all know, the necessary oxygen of his own intellectual life that he did so. I was regularly struck by the discipline with which he managed this. From time to time, a handwritten notice would appear on the outside of his office door that would say in neat felt tip pen, "Do not disturb, grant writing in progress." It was clear and it was uncompromising, and he was quite right to be so. We none of us disturbed him, and those grant writing sessions invariably, of course, delivered the goods. I draw again on Jocelyn Wogan-Brown here for a moment. She writes, I remember most vividly Mark's zest for everything, high precision and brilliant engagement. He was so good at organisation. He could have been a quite pernickety person, and he had his frustrations with systems and people, as we all do. But mostly, he just relished complex intellectual adventures and creative skilled organisation. After a brilliant British Academy conference that formed part of his extremely brilliant England's Immigrants Project, he snatched a quick glass of champagne with Caroline Palmer, the publisher of York Medieval Press, and with me, and laughingly confessed, eyes sparkling, that he was glad of a little time out down in London. Thank you, Jocelyn. And there are those sparkling eyes again, eloquently communicating all manner of things. For a senior management perspective, I turn to Professor Debbie Smith. She served for many years on the university's executive board alongside Mark, and she writes the following. Mark Ormrod was an exceptional colleague and a brilliant man. I can only be grateful that I knew him and could benefit from his wisdom, wit, tenacity, and endearing charm. Despite our very different disciplinary backgrounds, Mark and I shared a mutual respect for and collegiality in supporting intellectual curiosity in its many forms. It was only later that I realized just what an intellectual powerhouse Mark was, and had the opportunity to hear him speak about his historical passions and to debate with other colleagues. What an experience. Thank you, Debbie. Mark was, as we all know, quietly dazzling. He could hold a public audience in the palm of his hand, and he could power a large university meeting through a groaning agenda with significant efficiency and with clear outcomes. He was a brilliant historian and an excellent manager. But I'm going to finish with the words of David Johnson, and presumptuously, I dare to suggest that I think Mark himself would have been happy to have David round off this section. So it is that I move from the Pro Vice-Chancellor's office to the reception desk in Heslington Hall with David Johnson's tribute to Mark. Mark was a complete gentleman, and despite his formidable academic prowess, he always remained modest and humble. Unfailingly generous with both his time and expertise, I found Mark a very kind and remarkably humorous colleague. His illness came as a great shock, but he refused to be daunted. We all know Mark was a great historian, but I'll remember him as a nice man and a good friend. Thank you, David. And now I pass to Professor Tim Ayers for concluding remarks. Thank you, Tim.
Hello, I am Tim Ayers, and with Elizabeth Tyler, I'm currently co-director of the Centre for Medieval Studies here at York. Thanks very much, Judith and Sarah, for reminding us of so many aspects of Mark as a colleague, the administrative maestro, but also the wise counsellor and the scholar of intellectual passion and boundless generosity. As we've heard, Mark was twice director of the Centre for Medieval Studies. And working there with him subsequently, I've learned from him hugely about interdisciplinarity, both how to do it and how to construct it in working with others. As a relatively new arrival at York, I watched him generate, as if by magic, the moving parts for our interdisciplinary research project on St. Stephen's Chapel, Westminster, and to articulate collaboration across institutions as diverse as the National Archives and the Houses of Parliament, all brought together with Mark's inimitable alchemy. I also had the privilege of teaching with Mark in those very enjoyable co-teaching arrangements described by Joanna, experiencing exactly that pitching of things at just the right level and the way he noticed every student. Support for the next generation of medievalists continued to be a cause very close to Mark's heart. Together, he and Richard have funded studentships at MA level and a PhD prize at the Centre for Medieval Studies. So to build upon that legacy, as the Dean explained earlier, we've set up a Mark Ormrod Fund to help medieval graduate students. And if you'd like to contribute, a link to the fund is on the schedule for this evening. We are approaching the end of our event for today. Once the pandemic has passed, we plan to organise a memorial service for Mark in York Minster next year, and a conference in his honour to celebrate his scholarship, as Craig mentioned earlier. But to bring proceedings to a close for now, it's a great pleasure and a privilege first to introduce Richard Dobson, Mark's partner of 25 years, to say a few words, and finally to hear a reading chosen by Mark himself. Richard will be known to many of you. As we've heard already this evening, he has been the staunchest friend to the Centre for Medieval Studies and indeed the University of York, extending hospitality and the warmest of welcomes to countless students, colleagues and visitors over the years. So in introducing you, Richard, allow me to extend the warmest of welcomes back and to thank you on behalf of all of us. So please imagine our very warm applause. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Tim, for your very kind words. Tim, a fellow founder member of the YO31 Dining Club, much loved by Mark, where we had some marvellous meals out. On behalf of Mark's mum, Margaret, who is watching at her home in South Wales, his brothers and our extended families, I would like to start by saying a great big thank you for all the wonderful things you've said about him. We have been overwhelmed by the outpouring of grief among the academic community in response to his untimely death, and it has offered us a great deal of comfort to know how much he was respected and loved by his colleagues, peers, and all the former students who took the time to write to us to express their condolences. If I'm allowed to say it, he was a one-off, and to use a cliche, they broke the mold when Mark was created. Away from academic life, he was the same kind, considerate, patient man that you all knew. Well, he had to be to put up with me. When he did lose his temper, which was extremely rare, and usually with me, he would become very Welsh, which always made me laugh and diffused the situation. One of his oft-used phrases was, "I bet TF Tout didn't have to do the ironing." We talk in the family about the Ormrodic sense of achievement. Every day, one must achieve something, no matter how small. Mark followed this fully and wouldn't be fobbed off if, in response to his question on a Saturday morning, "What are we going to achieve today?" if I replied, "Inner peace." We had to do something. When we were on holiday, the day would be meticulously planned. During one of our trips to Rome, Mark's favourite city, he decided that the next morning, a Sunday, we would visit some churches. The route was planned, and armed with his guidebooks, we set off to see as many as possible before they shut for the afternoon. We managed 21, a record I believe we still hold. I was taken down into crypts, up into towers, and shown round some of the wonderful medieval churches, all while services were going on, to see perhaps just one feature that he had singled out as important. The depth of his knowledge, as you all know, was extraordinary. I don't want you to think that he couldn't relax. He could. And on one holiday to a tiny Greek island where there was very little in the way of cultural heritage, he was perfectly happy to sit by the sea, reading, and managed over the course of 14 days, of course, to read 14 books. But Mark the historian was never far away. In 2006, we became civil partners. When gay marriage became law in 2014, I asked him to marry me, and he refused. Because he said, by remaining civil partners, we would be part of a unique group of people in history. PhD fodder for the future. Mark lived life to the full. He was never happier than when he could spend a day or two at TNA, poring over manuscripts. If you saw his last TV appearance on The Bone Detectives, filmed at the National Archives, he was very cross at the end of filming, as the archivist had insisted on turning the documents for him. He said to me, "I've been handling medieval documents for 40 years. I know what to do." The joke was, among the family, that history came first, second, and third in his life. And after that, there was a little room for me. As you know, he loved good wine, good food, and good company. He was never happier than when the house was full of people and he could be mine host, looking after everybody, making sure they had a drink and plenty to eat. We hosted some great dinners and buffets together, which many of you shared with us. He especially loved Christmas, and if the turkey and chocolates could last until July, at least until July, Mark would be happy. This year is going to be difficult for us all, not only because we lost Mark, but also because we lost his father so quickly afterwards. With the support of friends and family, and despite the virus, we will get through it. We hope you are all able to join us in person at York Minster for the memorial service, which it is hoped will take place next summer, virus permitting. Although, as you've heard, no date has been set yet. In recent years, Mark forged a very close bond with my younger grandson, Louis. One day when Louis was about 2, we were in the park and heard Louis say to the little boy next to him on the climbing frame, "This is my granddad, and this is my Mark." Our Mark is no longer with us. Unlike me at this moment, please don't be sad. We have lost a great man, but he would want us all to remember him laughing and having a good time. His legacy lives on through you. Thank you all once again for taking part in this event, and particular thanks to Craig, Tim, and the team at the university for organising it all. Back to you, Tim.
Thanks so much, Richard. The pleasure has all been ours. And now to the reading, which was chosen by Mark for his funeral. The words are read by Rebecca Ormrod, Mark's niece, and we're hugely grateful to you, Rebecca, for joining us this evening. We send our very best wishes to you and all of Mark's family back home in South Wales, in London and around the world. Over to you, Rebecca.
Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little lives are rounded with a sleep.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really wonderful. As we leave you, we're going to be presenting a selection of pictures of Mark in some of the many guises we have met him this evening, but also a few more for you to spot. We miss him in many different ways. Thanks again to all our contributors, to the production team behind the scenes, and especially to all of you for coming to celebrate Mark this evening. We look forward to seeing many of you again next year, in person, we hope. In the meanwhile, have the very best of possible Christmases. Goodbye from us in York.